They huddled in the darkness. 47 Japanese women pressed together in torn uniforms, listening as American boots approached their locked door. The sound echoed through the empty barracks. Steady, deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. They had been told what would happen. The propaganda had been clear. American soldiers were animals, barbarians, men who showed no mercy to women, men who did unspeakable things to prisoners. So they clutched their makeshift weapons, broken chair legs salvaged from the wreckage, sharpened spoons stolen from the mess kits of dead soldiers, pieces of metal twisted into something that might, if they were lucky, draw blood before the end came. And they waited. The oldest among them, Reiko, was 34 years old. She had been a head nurse before the war consumed everything. Her hands, steady and skilled at saving lives, now gripped a length of wood so hard her knuckles had gone white. In the dim light filtering through the shattered window, her face showed no fear. Only determination, only the grim acceptance of what she believed was coming. She thought of her daughter, 7 years old, living with her grandmother in Tokyo, or what was left of Tokyo. The city had burned. The radio broadcast before the surrender had made that much clear. But was her daughter alive? Had the fire taken her? Had starvation, had the bushes that fell like rain from American plains? These questions had haunted Reiko for months. Now, as the footsteps drew closer, she realized she would die without ever knowing the answers. Beside her, Haruka pressed her back against the wall. 22 years old, before the war, she had worked as a radio operator, her voice trained to be clear and steady over crackling transmissions now caught in her throat. Her father had been a history teacher in Tokyo, a quiet man who had warned her in whispered conversations when the military police were not listening that this war was madness, that Japan could not win, that the price would be paid in blood and ash. He had been right about everything. The last letter she had received from him was dated March of 1945. It had reached her on Saipan 2 weeks before the island fell. In careful coded language, he had told her the truth the government would not admit. The cities were burning, the people were starving, the war was lost. She had not heard from him since. The 19-year-old girl crouched in the corner began to cry. Yumi, an orphan who had volunteered for military service to escape poverty, to find purpose, to serve the emperor. She had believed every word they told her about glory and sacrifice and the divine destiny of Japan. Now she believed nothing except that she was about to die. Her hands shook as she gripped a piece of broken glass. Not much of a weapon, but it was something. When the Americans came through that door, when they did what she had been told they would do, at least she could fight. At least she could die with some small measure of dignity. The footsteps stopped. Right outside the door, the women held their breath. 47 hearts pounding in 47 chests. 47 minds racing through memories of home, of family, of all the small moments that made up a life now about to end. The door handle turned. Slowly, the hinges creaked, and the door swung open. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the work lights outside. 2 soldiers in American uniforms, and between them a woman in a nurse's uniform. The white fabric seemed to glow in the harsh electric light. Reiko tensed. This was it. This was the moment. She raised her makeshift weapon, ready to strike, ready to go down fighting if that was all she could do. But the Americans did not rush forward, did not reach for weapons, did not shout or threaten. Instead, they stepped into the barracks slowly, carefully, as if approaching frightened animals rather than enemy soldiers. And they carried something in their arms. Blankets, thick wool blankets in olive drab, the kind issued to American troops, clean, whole, still smelling faintly of soap and storage. The nurse spoke. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. The words were English, incomprehensible to most of the women. But then a voice came from behind the Americans, a Japanese voice, male, heavily accented but speaking their language. The temperature drops at night. We brought extra blankets. And tea, hot tea to help you sleep. The women stared. This made no sense. The Americans walked further into the barracks, their movements slow and deliberate, non-threatening. They began placing blankets on the empty cots, folding them neatly, as if preparing beds for guests rather than prisoners. One of the soldiers carried a large metal thermos. Steam rose from the spout as he unscrewed the cap. The smell of tea filled the air. Real tea, green tea, the scent of pumpkin. He poured the hot liquid into simple tin cups, set them on a small table near the door, stepped back. The nurse looked at each woman in turn. Her face showed no hatred, no disgust, no cruelty, only something that looked almost like concern. She said something else in English. The translator repeated it. Sleep well. Then they left. The door closed softly behind them. Not slammed, not locked, just closed. For 30 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was breathing, ragged and uncertain. Then Ayumi, the 19-year-old, started to laugh. It was not a joyful sound. It was high and brittle and edged with something close to hysteria. But it was laughter nonetheless. Blankets, she said in Japanese, her voice breaking. They brought us blankets. The incongruity of it hit them all at once. They had prepared for torture, for rape, for execution, for all the horrors their officers had promised would come if they were captured alive. Instead, the enemy had brought them blankets and tea. Some of the women began to cry. Others joined in the laughter. A few did both at once, their bodies shaking with the release of tension that had been building for hours, for days, for months. Haruka set down her piece of metal. It clattered against the floor, suddenly seeming absurd. A pathetic weapon against enemies who had come armed with kindness. She walked slowly to the table, picked up one of the cups of tea. The metal was almost too hot to hold. She brought it to her lips and sipped. The taste exploded across her tongue. Real green tea. Not the bitter substitute they had been drinking for the past year. Not the weak brew made from reused leaves. Real tea. Hot and perfect and tasting of everything she had lost. She closed her eyes and a tear ran down her cheek. One by one, the other women approached, took their own cups, drank, and tasted for the first time in so long something that reminded them of home. Reiko was the last to move. She stood where she had been standing, the wooden club still gripped in her hand, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to reconcile what she had been taught with what she had just witnessed. Americans were supposed to be monsters. That was what every officer had told them. Every propaganda broadcast, every government newspaper. Americans showed no mercy. Americans had no honor. Americans would do terrible things to captured women. But these Americans had brought blankets. She looked at the thick wool fabric folded on the nearest cot, reached out, touched it. The material was soft, clean, real. She picked up the blanket and held it to her face. It smelled of soap and something else, something indefinable, something that was not threatening, not dangerous, safe. The word appeared in her mind unbidden. This blanket smelled safe. She wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth sank into her bones, for the first time in months, real warmth. Not the damp heat of tropical Saipan, not the clammy cold of the cave where they had hidden. Just warmth. And suddenly, inexplicably, Reiko began to cry. Not silent tears, not dignified grief. She sobbed, deep, wrenching sounds that came from somewhere primal. The kind of crying that happens when something inside finally breaks. When the armor you have worn for so long finally cracks and everything you have been holding back comes flooding out. The other women gathered around her, touched her shoulders, her back, her hands. They cried together. 47 women who had expected death and received something they could not name, something that felt dangerously close to compassion. That night they slept. For the first time since their capture, they actually slept. Not the half-dozing vigilance of frightened animals. Not the exhausted unconsciousness of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Real sleep. The kind that comes when against all logic and expectation you feel safe enough to let your guard down. Haruka woke once in the darkness. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then memory returned. The barracks, the Americans, the blankets. She pulled the wool fabric tighter around herself and looked at the sleeping women around her. In the dim light, their faces looked peaceful. Almost content. This made no sense. Nothing about this made sense. But sense or not, it was real. It was happening. And as Haruka drifted back into sleep, she thought about all the things she had been told, all the propaganda, all the warnings, all the certainty that the enemy was evil incarnate. And she wondered for the first time what else they had been lied to about. The story of how 47 Japanese women came to be prisoners of war on a remote Pacific island begins 6 months earlier, before the blankets, before the Americans, before everything changed. Saipan in 1945 was an island of death. The battle for control of this small piece of rock in the Marianas had been one of the bloodiest engagements of the Pacific War. 30,000 Japanese soldiers had died defending it. Most had chosen suicide over surrender. Banzai charges into American machine gun fire. Officers shooting their own men to prevent capture. Entire units jumping from cliffs rather than face the dishonor of defeat. The Americans had won. Of course they had won. The outcome had never really been in doubt. But the cost had been measured in blood and broken bodies on both sides. Among the ruins of destroyed bunkers and collapsed buildings, the victors found something they had not expected. Survivors, not just soldiers but support staff, clerks and radio operators and nurses. Men and women who had been stationed on Saipan to keep the military machine running. Most of the men had died, in the fighting or by their own hand. But some of the women had survived, hidden in caves and basements in the rubble of what had once been a hospital. 47 of them, ranging in age from barely 19 to their mid-30s. They had waited in the darkness for weeks, eating whatever they could scavenge, drinking rainwater collected in shell craters, listening to the sounds of American vehicles and American voices, and knowing that discovery was inevitable. When the Marines finally found them, they were more ghosts than women, hollow-eyed, starving, dressed in rags that had once been crisp military uniforms. Some had injuries, burns, cuts, infected wounds that had gone untreated because there was no medicine, no doctors, no help. They had barricaded themselves in the basement of what remained of their hospital, piled debris against the door, made weapons from whatever they could find, and waited. The Americans had to use crowbars to break through. The sound of metal on concrete echoed through the ruins. The women inside screamed. Some tried to run deeper into the building. Others froze their minds, simply refusing to process what was happening. Reiko had stepped forward. She was the ranking officer among them, the oldest, the one who had by default become their leader. She raised her hands above her head and spoke rapid Japanese that none of the Marines understood. She was surrendering, trying to surrender, hoping that surrender would mean something, that it would buy them some small measure of mercy. The Marines lowered their rifles, gestured for the women to come out, and one by one they did, blinking in the bright tropical sunlight like creatures emerging from underground, shielding their eyes, stumbling over rubble. An officer barked orders. Trucks arrived. The women were loaded into the back, packed together, gripping the sides as the vehicles bounced over cratered roads. Through the canvas covering, they caught glimpses of the island they thought they knew. It was gone. Everything was gone. The palm trees that had lined the roads were now blackened stumps. The villages where local people had lived were nothing but ash. The military installations where they had worked were craters and twisted metal. And everywhere were bodies, Japanese bodies, still lying where they had fallen, bloating in the heat, covered in flies. One young woman turned and vomited over the side of the truck. No one paid attention. They had all seen worse. They had all smelled worse. The island reeked of death, the sweet, sick smell that clings to everything and gets into your nose and your mouth and your lungs until you think you will never be free of it. The truck ride lasted 20 minutes but felt like hours. When they finally stopped, the canvas was pulled back and bright work lights flooded in. The women squinted against the glare, saw American soldiers standing in formation, watching them. Haruka studied their faces, tried to read their expressions. Some looked curious. Some looked bored. Some looked, was that pity? Did the enemy pity them? They were ordered out of the trucks. Most climbed down slowly, their legs shaking from exhaustion and fear and months of poor nutrition. 2 women could not walk, had to be carried by American soldiers who handled them carefully, almost gently. This confused the women more than anything. Gentle enemies. The concept did not compute. They were lined up outside a long wooden building. Fresh lumber, recently constructed, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers with searchlights. A proper prisoner of war camp. The Americans had built it specifically for captured Japanese. An officer approached. clean uniform, clipboard in hand. Behind him walked a Japanese-American soldier, young, maybe 25, wearing the same uniform as the other Americans but with a face that looked like home. The officer spoke. The Japanese-American translated. His Japanese was good but accented. Born in America, Haruka realized. A second-generation immigrant, fighting for the country that had bombed his parents' homeland. You will be processed. You will be given medical attention. You will be housed here. You are prisoners of war and will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The words were formal, official, empty of threat, but also empty of comfort. Just procedure. Reiko did not know what the Geneva Convention was. None of them did. It had never been mentioned in their training. Japan had signed the treaty, but never ratified it. The concept of international law governing how prisoners were treated was foreign to women who had been taught that surrender itself was the ultimate dishonor. One by one they were taken into the building. The waiting was torture. Each woman who disappeared through the door might never come back, might be taken somewhere else, somewhere the others could not see, where anything might happen. Those who remained outside whispered prayers, gripped each other's hands, tried not to imagine the worst, even though imagination was all they had. When Haruka's turn came, her legs almost gave out. She was 22 years old. She had worked as a radio operator, had spent the war transmitting coded messages she did not fully understand, and now she was walking toward what she believed would be her execution. Two women in white uniforms met her inside. American women, nurses. They smiled, actually smiled, as if greeting a patient at a hospital rather than processing an enemy prisoner. Through the translator, they explained what would happen, a medical examination, to check for injuries, for disease, for malnutrition. The exam was clinical, professional. They cleaned the cut on her arm that had become infected, applied antiseptic that stung, but not cruelly, wrapped it in clean white bandage. They checked her eyes with a light, looked in her throat, listened to her lungs with a cold stethoscope. When they found she was severely malnourished, one nurse made notes on a clipboard while the other squeezed Haruka's shoulder. The touch was brief but unmistakable, sympathetic, caring. No one hit her, no one made crude comments, no one touched her anywhere they should not. The nurses did their job with the same efficiency and compassion they would show any patient. When it was over, they handed her a cup of water, told her through the translator to drink slowly, that her stomach was not ready for large amounts of liquid all at once. Haruka drank. Her hands shook so badly that water spilled down her chin. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to be revealed as a trick, a psychological game before the real torture began. It never came. The examination ended. The nurses directed her to another room, told her to wait there with the others who had already been processed. She walked out in a daze, found 3 other women sitting on benches. Their faces showed the same confusion, the same disbelief. One of them, Naomi, a 28-year-old nurse, whispered, "They did not hurt you." Haruka shook her head. No, they were kind." The word hung in the air between them. Kind. It felt dangerous to say it, dangerous to believe it, as if acknowledging kindness from the enemy would somehow make them traitors, would somehow validate the choice to surrender rather than die. But kind was the only word that fit. More women joined them, each with the same expression, each having experienced the same inexplicable gentleness. Until all 47 sat together in that waiting room, looking at each other and silently asking the same question. What is happening? What kind of enemy treats prisoners with medical care? What kind of barbarians smile while tending to infected wounds? What kind of monsters show compassion? The questions had no answers. Not yet. But they planted seeds, tiny cracks in the foundation of everything these women had been taught to believe. And those cracks, small as they were, would grow. After the medical examinations, they were directed to another building. Inside, they found something that made them stop and stare. Bathtubs, large metal tubs filled with water. And the water was steaming, hot water. They had not bathed in hot water since leaving Japan. On Saipan, there had been no facilities, no running water toward the end. They had washed when they could in cold streams or with buckets of rainwater. Quick, furtive cleanings that never really got them clean. But this was hot water, Deliberately heated, prepared for them, American nurses supervised, handed out bars of white soap. Industrial strength, but real soap that actually lathered. And towels. Clean, rough cotton towels. Through the translator, please wash. Take your time. The water will help. The women undressed awkwardly, tried to maintain some modesty even in their state. They had been taught that showing their bodies to anyone, especially enemies, was shameful. But they had also not been truly clean in so long that the desire for cleanliness overrode everything else. Haruka stepped into the tub. The water was almost too hot. It stung against skin that had become sensitive from months of dirt and exposure. But as she sank down, as the heat penetrated her muscles, she felt something release inside her. She picked up the soap, turned it over in her hands. It was real, solid, proof that this was not a dream or hallucination or death throes fantasy. She began to wash, scrubbed her skin until it turned pink, washed her hair 3 times, worked the soap into every part of her body that she could reach. The dirt and oil and accumulated filth of months dissolved away. The water around her turned gray, then brown. Around her, other women did the same. Some washed mechanically, going through the motions. Others washed with something approaching reverence, as if cleanliness itself was a prayer. And some began to cry, not loud crying, not the sobs that had come later with the blankets, just quiet tears that mixed with the bath water and disappeared. Tears of relief and confusion and the overwhelming strangeness of being treated like a human being by people who were supposed to be devils. When they emerged from the baths, they were given clothes, simple cotton garments, not uniforms, not prison clothes, just plain shirts and loose pants, clean and whole and smelling of laundry soap. Haruka put on the shirt. It was too big, hung loosely on her thin frame. But it was clean and soft, and for a moment she felt almost normal. Almost like a person rather than a soldier or a prisoner or a piece of war debris. Then came the smell that would break something inside all of them. Rice. The scent drifted through the air, unmistakable, undeniable. Real white rice being cooked nearby. The women looked at each other. Rice, when had any of them last eaten real rice, not the mixture of barley and millet and whatever else could be scraped together? Not the thin gruel that passed for food toward the end when supplies stopped coming. Real rice. They were led to a mess hall, a large tent with wooden tables and benches. American soldiers sat on one side eating and talking. A section had been cleared for the Japanese prisoners. The women sat slowly, uncertain, watching the Americans for any sign that this was a setup, that the food would be poisoned, that this was all an elaborate way to humiliate them. But the Americans ignored them, just kept eating their own meals, talking among themselves, occasionally glancing over with curiosity, but no hostility. Then the food arrived, trays placed in front of each woman, and on those trays something that looked like a meal from before the war, before everything went wrong. White rice, steaming and fluffy and perfectly cooked. Grilled fish, real fish, not the dried, salted scraps they had been eating. Miso soup, made properly, with real miso paste, with tofu and seaweed floating in the broth, pickled vegetables, sukemono like their mothers used to make, and hot green tea in simple cups. Someone had gone to significant effort to prepare Japanese food, real Japanese food, not American rations, not the bland, unfamiliar meals they might have expected. Food that tasted like home. Reiko picked up her chopsticks. Her hands trembled. She lifted a bit of rice to her mouth. The taste was perfection. The texture was exactly right. The warmth spread through her mouth and down her throat and into her chest like liquid comfort. She closed her eyes. A tear ran down her face. She thought of the last 6 months. The starvation, the 3 women in their unit who had died because their bodies simply gave up, who had starved to death while Japanese officers hoarded the remaining supplies, who had died because no help came, because no one cared. And now the enemy was feeding her real rice. Around her, the scene repeated. Women eating slowly, savoring every bite. Others eating quickly, frantically, as if afraid the food would be taken away. As if this was their one chance and they had to take full advantage while they could. Ayumi ate her miso soup in small sips. Each spoonful was a memory. Of her mother's kitchen before she died. Of meals before the war. Of a normalcy that seemed to belong to a different lifetime. The soup tasted almost exactly like her mother used to make it. How did the Americans know? How did they understand what this food meant? How did they care enough to try? Then something happened that no one expected. Ayumi dropped her chopsticks. They clattered against the metal tray. She covered her face with both hands and began to sob. Not quiet crying, deep wrenching sobs that shook her entire thin frame. The kind of crying that comes from a place beyond words, beyond thought. Pure emotion released all at once. The sound echoed through the mess tent. Conversation among the American soldiers stopped. They looked over, some with concern, some with confusion, not understanding what was happening, but clearly affected by it. An American nurse approached quickly, knelt beside Ayumi's bench, spoke in English, soft words that the girl could not understand but whose tone was unmistakable. Caring, worried, the translator hurried over, asked what was wrong. Was she hurt? Was the food bad? Reiko answered for her. Her own voice thick with unshed tears. She is confused. We were told you would hurt us, torture us, kill us. Instead, you give us medicine. You let us bathe. You feed us food from our own country. She does not understand. None of us understand. The translator repeated this to the nurse. Her face changed. Something like sadness crossed her features. She reached out, patted Ayumi's shoulder gently, said something else that the translator did not bother to interpret because the meaning was clear in every gesture. I know. I understand. You are safe here. The nurse stood, left the women to their meal. But Haruka saw her wipe her eyes as she walked away. The Americans were crying too, not from cruelty or mockery, but from something else. Something Haruka did not have words for yet. Empathy, maybe. Recognition that the women in front of them were people, were suffering, were confused and frightened and overwhelmed by kindness they had been taught not to expect. The meal continued in near silence, each woman lost in her own thoughts, her own memories, her own attempts to reconcile propaganda with reality. When they finished eating, they were given more tea. Some women had eaten too much. Their stomachs, unused to full meals, cramped and rebelled. But even the nausea felt like a blessing compared to the constant gnawing emptiness of starvation. As evening fell, they were taken to their barracks, the building where hours later the Americans would return with blankets and tea, where everything would begin to change. But first they had to process what had already happened, had to try to make sense of a day that defied every expectation. 47 women, enemy soldiers, prisoners of war, taught their entire lives that Americans were monsters, and in one day treated with more kindness and dignity than they had received from their own officers in years. It was incomprehensible. It was terrifying, and it was real. As Haruka lay on her cot that first night before the blankets came, she stared at the ceiling and tried to understand, tried to fit the pieces together in a way that made sense. She thought about her father, the history teacher, the man who had warned her that this war was based on lies, that the propaganda could not be trusted, that the truth was far more complicated than what the government wanted them to believe. He had been right. The question was, what else had been a lie? What other certainties were built on foundations of sand? If the Americans were not monsters, what did that mean about everything she had been told, about the war, about Japan, about honor and sacrifice and duty? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswerable, overwhelming. And then the door opened, and the Americans came with their blankets and their tea, and nothing would ever be the same again. Morning came with the sound of a bell, not harsh, not military. Just a simple bell announcing the start of another day. The women woke slowly, disoriented, having to remember where they were, having to process once again that they were alive, that they had survived the night, that the Americans had not come to hurt them. Sunlight streamed through the screened windows, real sunlight, not filtered through cave rocks or basement rubble. Clean morning light that painted everything gold. The door opened, the same young corporal from the night before, the one who had brought the blankets. He gestured for them to come outside. His face showed neither hostility nor particular friendliness, just duty, a job to be done. They filed into the morning air. The tropical heat was already building, but it felt different than on Saipan during the fighting. No smell of death, no smoke, just the clean scent of ocean and growing things. Breakfast was served in the same mess tent. Rice porridge, fish, pickled vegetables, hot tea. Simple food, but more than they had seen in months. More than some of them had eaten in years. After the meal, an announcement came through the translator. They would be assigned work details, light duties, laundry, kitchen help, cleaning. Nothing strenuous, and they would be paid, not in real money but in camp script that could be used at the canteen to buy small luxuries. The concept was alien. Prisoners being paid for work, being allowed to buy things. This was not how war worked. This was not how enemies treated each other. Fumiko spoke up, 31 years old, from an aristocratic family, rigid in her beliefs and unwilling to bend. Her voice was sharp when she addressed Reiko in Japanese, loud enough for others to hear. They are buying us, trying to make us soft, make us forget who we are. Some women nodded, others looked uncertain. The group was beginning to split. Those who wanted to maintain the old certainties and those who were beginning to question everything. But Reiko, as the ranking person among them, made the decision. We will work. We will follow their rules. We are prisoners. We have no choice. Haruka was assigned to the laundry detail. Washing sheets and towels in large tubs, the work was mundane, repetitive, but there was something almost meditative about it. Something that gave her mind space to wander while her hands stayed busy. An American soldier worked nearby, tall, young, maybe 20 years old. He had introduced himself through gestures and broken words as Sullivan, from somewhere called Minnesota, a place Haruka had never heard of and could not picture. He tried to speak Japanese. His pronunciation was terrible, but he tried, held up a bar of soap and said the Japanese word, seibun, or his version of it, then pointed to himself and said the English, soap. Haruka found herself repeating it, soap. The word felt strange in her mouth, foreign. But Sullivan grinned as if she had accomplished something remarkable, clapped his hands once, gave her a thumbs up. It was such a normal human interaction, such an everyday moment of one person teaching another person a word, that it left Haruka feeling off balance for hours afterward. This was the enemy, this friendly young man with a terrible accent and easy smile. This was supposed to be a monster, a barbarian, someone who would have hurt her given the chance. But he was teaching her English words and grinning when she got them right. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. Days settled into routine. Wake at dawn, breakfast, work detail, lunch, more work, dinner, evening in the barracks. The sameness was both comforting and unsettling. Where was the cruelty? Where was the degradation? Where was everything they had been promised would happen? The Americans treated them like prisoners of war, not honored guests, certainly not friends, but not animals either. Just people who had to be housed and fed according to some set of rules that most of the women still did not fully understand. A week passed, then 10 days. And on the 10th morning, something happened that brought all the old fears rushing back. Roll call at breakfast showed only 46 women. Someone was missing. Setsuko, 26 years old, a secretary before the war. Quiet, competent, unremarkable in most ways. She had worked in the laundry detail with Haruka, had shared a bunk near the door, had eaten breakfast the day before and seemed fine. Now her cot was empty. Her few possessions were gone, and no one had seen her leave. Panic rippled through the group, whispered conversations in rapid Japanese. Fumiko's voice rose above the others, sharp with vindication. I told you this was all a trick. They have taken her to make an example, to show us what happens when they tire of pretending to be civilized. Reiko demanded to see Captain Warner. The request was granted quickly, too quickly, as if the Americans had been expecting it. Warner met them in her office, a small building near the medical facility, clean, organized, with a desk and filing cabinets and a photograph on the wall. The photo showed Warner in her uniform standing next to another woman, younger, also in a nurse's uniform, both smiling. Through the translator, Reiko asked the question bluntly. Where is Setsuko? Warner's face remained calm. Professional. She is safe. She has been transferred to different duties. Administrative work. What kind of administrative work? Translation. She volunteered to work as an official translator. Her English is quite good, better than our current translators. We need her help to communicate more effectively with all of you. The answer should have been reassuring, but it raised new questions, new suspicions. Why would Setsuko volunteer? Why would she work for the Americans? Was she a traitor? Had she been one all along? The questions followed them back to the barracks. Fumiko was certain she knew the answer. Setsuko had betrayed them, had sold herself to the enemy for better treatment, for privileges, for safety. But that afternoon, the truth revealed itself. Haruka and Naomi were walking past the administration building when they heard voices, one speaking English, one responding in Japanese. They looked through the open window and saw something that made them stop and stare. Setsuko sat at a desk across from an American officer, papers spread between them. She was translating, fluently, efficiently, helping the officer understand forms and documents and administrative details. She wore a clean uniform, not a prisoner's clothes, something more official, and she looked focused, purposeful, almost content. Haruka felt her breath catch. This was not a woman being forced to work. This was someone who had chosen this, who had volunteered just as Warner said. But why that evening when Setsuko returned to the barracks, the confrontation was immediate. Fumiko blocked the door, her face twisted with anger and something deeper, something like fear. Traitor. You work for them now, you help the enemy. Setsuko set down her papers, looked Fumiko in the eye. Her voice was steady, calm, almost tired. I am helping us. I translate so they understand what we need, so there are no misunderstandings, so we are treated fairly. Fairly, we are prisoners. There is no fair treatment in war. The war is over. The words dropped like stones into water, creating ripples that spread outward, touching everything. Fumiko's face went white, then red. She moved forward, and before anyone could react, she slapped Setsuko hard across the face. The sound echoed through the barracks. Women gasped. Some moved to intervene. Others froze, uncertain whose side to take. Reiko stepped between them. Her voice carried the weight of command she had earned through years of nursing and months of keeping these women alive. Enough. We are prisoners of war. Setsuko is not wrong to help translate. She is not wrong to try to make our situation better. But she sided with them. Fumiko's voice broke. She chose them over us. Setsuko touched her reddening cheek, looked at Fumiko with something like pity. I chose truth over lies. The statement hung in the air. Bold, dangerous, the kind of thing that would have gotten someone killed just months ago. But here in this strange American prison, where kindness replaced cruelty, Setsuko could say it, could speak the forbidden thought that had been growing in all their minds. That night a meeting was called, informal, tense. All 47 women gathered in the barracks after dinner. Setsuko stood in the center, and for the first time she told them the truth they had all been avoiding. I learned English 5 years ago, before the war got bad. I studied it because I thought it would help me get a better job. When I volunteered to translate, it was because I am tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of pretending. What lies? Multiple voices asked the question. All of them. That we were winning, that the Americans are monsters, that dying for the emperor is honorable. All lies. Fumiko's voice was cold. You have no honor. Setsuko turned to face her directly. Honor. What is honorable about the officer on Saipan who ordered 3 young nurses to kill themselves rather than be captured? What is honorable about letting women starve while officers hoard food? What is honorable about lying to an entire nation about a war we could never win? She looked around at all of them. Her voice rose. Passionate now. Urgent. The war is over. Japan surrendered. We are not serving the emperor anymore. We are just trying to survive. And I will not apologize for choosing life over death, for choosing truth over propaganda. The silence that followed was profound. Some women looked angry. Some looked thoughtful. Some looked lost, as if the ground beneath them had opened up and they were falling. Ayumi, the youngest, spoke up. Her voice was small but clear. I agree with Setsuko. I am tired of being lied to. Fumiko rounded on her. You are 19 years old. You know nothing. I know that the Americans have fed us better than our own officers did. I know that they gave us medicine and baths and blankets. I know that in 2 weeks here, I have been treated with more kindness than in 6 months on Saipan. The group fractured visibly, some moving closer to Fumiko, others edging toward Ayumi and Setsuko, and many, including Haruka, staying in the middle, uncertain, conflicted, trying to reconcile old beliefs with new realities. That night, sleep did not come easy for any of them. The questions were too loud, too insistent, too frightening in their implications. Haruka lay on her cot and thought about her father, the history teacher who had tried to warn her, who had understood before most people that this war was built on lies. She thought about Tokyo burning, about the propaganda broadcasts that promised victory even as the cities turned to ash. And she thought about the Americans, about Sullivan with his terrible Japanese pronunciation and friendly grin, about the nurses who had tended to infected wounds with gentle hands, about Captain Warner, who followed rules even when no one would have blamed her for cruelty. If the Americans were not monsters, what did that mean about everything else? About the war, about Japan, about the sacrifices that had been demanded of millions of people. The questions kept her awake until dawn. The next few days brought a different kind of routine. The work continued. The meals came regularly. But now there was tension within the group. Fumiko's faction of about 15 women kept to themselves, refused to smile at the Americans, ate their meals in stony silence, maintained what they called dignity, but what increasingly looked like stubborn denial. The others, led loosely by Ayumi and Naomi, began to adapt, learned English words, smiled back when Americans smiled at them, participated in the small rituals of camp life without resistance. And in the middle, the largest group, including Haruka and Reiko, remained uncertain, pulled both ways, unable to fully reject the old beliefs, but increasingly unable to maintain them in the face of daily evidence to the contrary. Then came the announcement that would force everyone to confront the truth they had been avoiding. Captain Warner called all 47 women to a meeting, in the evening, after dinner, in a building that had been set up with benches facing a white screen. Through Setsuko, who now translated officially for all camp announcements, Warner explained, "We are going to show you footage, news footage from Japan. Footage of what has happened to your country. You need to see it. You need to know the truth." Some women wanted to refuse. Fumiko stood up and declared she would not watch American propaganda. But Reiko overruled her. "We will all watch. We need to know what has happened at home." So they sat, 47 women on wooden benches, American soldiers and staff sitting in back. The lights went down, the projector whirred to life, and the screen lit up with images that would shatter what remained of their certainties. Hiroshima. The footage was from an American plane, showing the mushroom cloud rising. Then aerial shots of the aftermath, a city that had simply vanished, turned to ash and rubble and shadows burned into stone. Then ground footage, survivors walking through ruins, their skin hanging from their arms in sheets, their faces blank with shock. Bodies piled in streets, children crying next to dead parents, a mother carrying a dead baby refusing to let go. Some women covered their mouths. Others began to cry immediately. Haruka felt her stomach twist. She had heard about the atomic bombs, everyone had heard, but seeing it, seeing the scale of destruction, the totality of it, Nagasaki, more the same. 70,000 people dead in an instant, a city erased from existence in the time it takes to draw a breath. Then Tokyo, footage of the firebombing, American planes dropping incendiary bombs that created a firestorm, temperatures hot enough to boil water in canals, hot enough to make glass flow like liquid. 100,000 people dead in a single night. Haruka saw neighborhoods she recognized, the district where she had grown up, the streets where she had walked to school, the market where her mother had bought vegetables. All gone. Just blackened ruins and scattered debris, and the occasional wall standing alone like a gravestone. She thought of her father, the history teacher. The last letter had been in March. This footage was from March. The firebombing had happened when he would have been home, in their house, in the district she was looking at on the screen. He was dead. She knew it with sudden, awful certainty. Her father was dead, had died in those flames, had become one of those bodies the footage showed being pulled from ruins. Around her, other women were having similar realizations. Reiko cried out, a wordless sound of pain. Her daughter, her 7-year-old daughter. Had she been in Tokyo when the bombs fell? Was she alive, dead burned, starving in the ruins? Naomi fainted, had to be caught by the women on either side. Her face was chalk white, her breathing shallow. Ayumi covered her face with both hands and sobbed. Not the cathartic crying of the first night. This was grief, raw and devastating. But something else was happening too. Something that cut through even the horror of what they were seeing. Haruka glanced back at the Americans in the room, expected to see triumph, satisfaction, pride in their military might, in total victory. Instead, she saw discomfort, sadness. One young American soldier, barely 18, got up and left the room. His face was pale, his hand over his mouth as if he might be sick. These men were not celebrating. They were watching the same footage with something that looked almost like shame, regret. The images kept coming. Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, city after city shown in ruins. Millions dead, millions more homeless. Refugees streaming along roads with whatever they could carry. Children orphaned. Elderly left to die because there was no food, no medicine, no help. When the footage finally ended, the lights came up slowly. No one moved. 47 women sat in stunned silence, processing, trying to comprehend the scale of what had been done to their country. Captain Warner stood. Her face showed strain. This was not easy for her either. Through Setsuko, her words came carefully, deliberately. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. Your cities are being rebuilt. American aid is arriving now. Food, medicine, supplies. Your families, if they survived, are receiving help. From us. She paused. Let that sink in. We are not your friends, but we are no longer your enemies. We are all just people trying to survive what happened, trying to rebuild from the ashes. The words should have brought comfort, should have offered hope. But all Haruka could think was, the people who destroyed my city are now feeding its children. The paradox was too large to hold in her mind, too contradictory, too impossible. That night no one slept. They lay on their cots and stared at ceilings and processed grief and horror and confusion all mixed together into something that had no name. Haruka took out the small notebook she had been keeping, had been writing in when she could. She wrote in Japanese characters that no American could read. My father is dead, I am certain. Our neighborhood is gone, but the Americans who destroyed my city are now feeding its survivors. I cannot understand this. It makes no sense with anything I was taught, with anything I believed. If they are capable of such destruction, why are they capable of such kindness? If they could kill 100,000 people in one night, why do they bring us blankets and tea? What are they? What are we? What does any of this mean? The questions had no answers. But asking them was the beginning of something. The first real crack in the foundation of certainty that had been weakening since the night they were captured. Across the barracks, Reiko sat up all night, awake, thinking about her daughter. If the child had survived, she was alive because of American aid, American food, American medicine. The enemy was keeping her daughter alive while Reiko sat in an enemy prison eating enemy rice and sleeping under enemy blankets. The irony was too painful to bear. Fumiko sat rigid on her cot, refusing to cry, refusing to show weakness. But Haruka saw her hands shaking, saw the way she gripped the edge of her blanket, the American blanket that she had accepted because the night was cold and she was human and humans need warmth. Even Fumiko, the most resistant, the most traditional, was beginning to break. The next 2 weeks were the hardest yet. The women moved through their routines, but the joy, such as it was, had gone out of their adaptation. They had seen too much, knew too much, could no longer pretend that this was simple captivity with a simple eventual release. Their country was destroyed. Their families were dead or starving or scattered. And the people responsible were the same people treating them with dignity and care. How did you process that? How did you hold both truths at once? December came. The tropical island rarely got cold, but that year an unusual weather pattern brought storms and dropping temperatures. One night, wind howled through the camp. Rain hammered against the barracks. And the heating system, such as it was, failed completely. 47 women huddled under their single blankets, pressed together for warmth. Even Fumiko abandoned her pride and joined the group, too cold to maintain her separation. They shivered and waited for morning when repairs could be made. But around 8 in the evening they heard vehicles, engines running, doors slamming, urgent voices in English. Old fears returned. Why were Americans coming now? In the dark, in the storm, the door burst open. 3 soldiers entered, soaked through, rain dripping from their uniforms. Behind them, Captain Warner and 2 nurses, all of them drenched and breathing hard as if they had run through the storm. Setsuko came in last, shaking water from her jacket. Her voice was urgent as she translated. The heating system broke. Cannot be fixed until morning. You will freeze if you stay here. We are moving you to another barracks, one with a working stove. Please gather your things. Quickly. They scrambled to collect their few possessions, followed the Americans out into the storm. Rain lashed at them, wind tore at their clothes, but they ran across the compound to a larger building. Newer, better insulated. Inside, warmth hit them like a physical force. A potbelly stove in the center glowed red hot, radiating heat that drove away the chill immediately. The bunks here were better, thicker mattresses, and on each bunk 2 blankets instead of 1. At the foot of each bed sat a package, wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. Warner spoke. Setsuko translated. We apologize for the emergency. The packages contain some items to help you stay warm. And we brought hot soup and tea. 2 soldiers wheeled in a cart. A large pot of soup steamed on top. Stacks of bowls. A container of hot tea. The women stood frozen, water dripping from their hair and clothes onto the wooden floor, staring at the packages, at the soup, at the Americans who had run through a storm to move them to warmth. Haruka reached her bunk with trembling hands, opened the package slowly. Inside, she found thick wool socks, a flannel shirt soft and warm, a comb, a bar of good soap, not the industrial kind, and at the bottom wrapped separately a chocolate bar. She picked up that chocolate bar. Such a simple thing, such a small luxury, and something inside her shattered. She began to cry. Not quiet tears, not dignified grief, deep, racking sobs that came from somewhere beyond conscious control. Around her, the same scene repeated itself. Woman after woman opening packages and breaking down. Ayumi clutched wool socks to her chest and wept. Naomi pressed the flannel shirt to her face, her shoulders shaking. Reiko sat on her bunk, head bowed, tears falling silently onto her lap. Even Fumiko, especially Fumiko, the most stubborn, the most traditional, the most resistant. She stared at her package and whispered in Japanese, "Why? Why do they do this?" It was not a rhetorical question. It was real, desperate, a plea for understanding that no one could provide. Captain Warner stood in the center of the barracks, surrounded by 47 crying women. She had seen this before, had witnessed this moment when prisoners stopped seeing captors as enemies and started seeing them as people. It was always emotional, always difficult, always necessary. She sat down on an empty bunk, gestured for Reiko, Haruka, and Ayumi to join her. Setsuko sat nearby to translate, and Warner told them a story they had not known, had not expected. I had a younger sister, Margaret. She was 24 years old, a nurse like me. Warner gestured to the photograph on her desk, the one showing 2 women in uniform. December 7, 1941. She was working at the hospital in Pearl Harbor. When your country's planes attacked, she was in a ward full of patients, trying to evacuate them. A bomb hit the building. Direct hit. She died instantly, along with 30 patients she was trying to save. The room went silent. Even the crying stopped. 47 women stared at Warner, horror and understanding dawning. For 4 years, I hated the Japanese. Every prisoner I saw the people who killed Margaret. I saw the bombs falling. I saw the hospital burning. I wanted revenge. Warner's voice was steady, but Haruka could hear the emotion underneath. Raw even after all this time. But then I thought about what Margaret would want. She saved people. That was who she was. She would hate me if I let hatred control my actions. If I let revenge make me cruel. Warner looked around at all of them, met their eyes one by one. The Geneva Convention, these rules about how to treat prisoners, they are not just words on paper. They are what keep us human when everything else is falling apart. When every instinct screams for vengeance, these rules say no, say there are lines we do not cross, standards we maintain. Because that is what separates us from the darkness. So I care for you, Not because I have forgotten my sister, but because I remember her. If I let you suffer, Margaret died for nothing. But if I save you, she lives on. Through the compassion she taught me, through the choice to remain human even in war. No one spoke. No one could. The weight of Warner's words pressed down on all of them. Haruka thought about the propaganda, about being told that Americans were monsters, that they had no honor, no compassion, no humanity. And here was an American woman whose sister had been killed by Japanese bombs, choosing to feed and clothe and care for Japanese prisoners, choosing mercy over revenge, choosing to honor her dead sister through kindness rather than cruelty. It was the most profound thing Haruka had ever witnessed. That night, wrapped in American blankets, wearing American clothes full of American soup, 47 Japanese women began to understand something that would change them forever. The line between enemy and friend, between us and them, between right and wrong, was not where they had been told it was. It was somewhere else entirely. And finding it would mean questioning everything they had ever believed. January arrived with news that should have meant freedom and homecoming and the end of their ordeal. But when Captain Warner made the announcement standing before all 47 women in the mess hall, the reaction was not what anyone expected. You are going home. A ship will arrive at the end of the month. You will be repatriated to Japan. Silence. Heavy, frightened silence. No cheers. No tears of relief. No celebration. Just 47 women looking at each other with something that looked distressingly like dread. Ayumi was the first to voice what many were feeling. Her voice was small but clear in the quiet room. I am afraid to go home. The confession hung in the air. Shameful, honest, unbearable. Fumiko found her voice. For once it lacked its usual sharp edge. What will our families think? We are healthy. We gain in weight. We look better than before the war. While they starved. Haruka touched her own face. It was true. 4 months of regular meals had changed them all. Filled out hollow cheeks. Brought color back to skin that had been gray with malnutrition. They looked healthier than they had in years, and that health felt like an accusation, like evidence of betrayal. Naomi spoke up. How do we explain this? That we were fed by the enemy while our people ate scraps, that we slept in warm beds while they froze in ruins, that we survived while millions died. Reiko closed her eyes. Thought of her daughter, 8 years old now, 2 years since they had last seen each other. Would the girl even recognize her mother? Would she understand why her mother looked well-fed and rested? Would she hate her for it? The questions that had been lurking beneath the surface for weeks now emerged fully. Survival had become their sin. Being alive, being healthy, being treated with kindness by the enemy. All of it felt like crimes they would have to answer for. That evening, the barracks was subdued. Women sat on their bunks and contemplated a return to a homeland that no longer existed, to families who might not have survived, to a society that would judge them for the simple act of not dying. But other tensions were building too, tensions that would come to a head in ways no one expected. Over the past month, Ayumi had changed. The 19-year-old who had been so frightened that first night now laughed easily, spoke English phrases with Sullivan and other guards, smiled at Americans without hesitation. She had adapted faster than anyone, had let go of the old beliefs with a completeness that some found admirable and others found suspicious. Too suspicious. Fumiko had been watching, had been noting every interaction, every English word that came too easily, every comfort with American presence that seemed too natural. And one evening she shared her suspicions with a small group of women who still maintained distance from their captors. Ayumi learns too fast, speaks too well. She was comfortable with them from the beginning, as if she already knew them. What are you saying? Naomi asked, though she already knew. Fumiko's voice was cold, clear. I am saying she might have been working with them all along. A spin, an agent, planted among us before Saipan fell. The accusation was absurd. But in the paranoid atmosphere of captivity and the confusion of everything they had experienced, absurd things could take root and grow. The whispers spread. Ayumi is too friendly. Ayumi learned English too fast. Ayumi volunteered to help in the kitchens, where she could hear American conversations. Ayumi, Ayumi, Ayumi. The 19-year-old felt the shift before she understood it. Women who had been friendly now avoided her eyes. Conversations stopped when she approached. She was being isolated, cut off. It took 3 days before she learned why. Fumiko confronted her directly, in the barracks, in front of everyone. Her voice carried accusation and anger and something deeper. Fear that if Ayumi was a traitor, what did that mean about everything else? About the kindness they had accepted, about the trust they had begun to feel. You were planted among us. A spy for the Americans, that is why you adapt so easily, why you are so comfortable with them. You were one of them all along. Ayumi stared, shock and hurt and disbelief warring on her young face. That is insane. I was on Saipan, you saw me there, working in the office, typing reports. I nearly died in the cave with all of you, or you pretended to be in danger. Fumiko pressed forward. You speak English too well. Learn too fast. No one picks up a foreign language that quickly unless they already knew it. I learn fast because I am young, because I want to survive, because I am tired of being afraid. But some women were nodding. Fumiko's faction had grown. Not large but vocal, and the accusation once spoken could not be unspoken. Haruka watched the scene unfold with growing horror. This was madness, but it was also familiar. The same paranoia that had consumed Japan during the war. The thought police, the accusations of disloyalty, the need to find traitors to blame for defeat. They were recreating the very system that had destroyed them. Reiko stood up, her voice cut through the rising argument with the authority of her position and her age. Enough. We will settle this now. Ayumi will answer questions. We will vote. And then this ends. It was a trial. Informal but real. Ayumi stood in the center of the barracks, 46 women arrayed around her in a rough circle, some hostile, some sympathetic, most uncertain. Fumiko led the prosecution. Where did you learn English? I did not learn it before I am learning now. Sullivan teaches me words. The nurses teach me. I listen and I remember because I have to, because I want to survive. Why are you so comfortable with them? Because they have not hurt me, because they feed me and house me and treat me like a person. Why should I fear people who have shown me only kindness? That is exactly what a spy would say. Fumiko's voice was triumphant, as if she had caught Ayumi in a trap. But Haruka had heard enough. She stood up. Her voice was steady but held an edge of anger. Stop this, all of you. We sound like the military police, like the thought police who destroyed our country, finding traitors everywhere, accusing anyone who adapted, who questioned, who dared to think differently. She turned to face Fumiko directly. Ayumi is not a spy. She is a 19-year-old girl who lost her mother young, volunteered for service to escape poverty, nearly died on Saipan, and is now trying to survive the best way she knows how. If learning English and smiling at guards makes her a traitor, then we are all traitors. We have all eaten their food, slept in their beds, accepted their blankets. The barracks went quiet. Haruka's words had struck something deep, something true that everyone felt but few had articulated. We are angry at Ayumi because she reminds us of our own surrender, our own acceptance, our own slow realization that everything we were told was a lie. She shows us who we are becoming, and we hate her for it because we hate ourselves. Ayumi was crying now, silent tears running down her young face. But she stood straight, did not collapse, did not beg. Reiko looked around the circle, saw women struggling with themselves, with their beliefs, with the cognitive dissonance of being well treated by enemies. She made her decision. Ayumi is not a spy, she is one of us, and this trial is over. We will not do this to each other. We will not tear ourselves apart because we are confused and frightened. The Americans have shown us mercy. The least we can do is show it to each other. Fumiko started to protest, but Reiko cut her off with a look, the kind of look that had commanded respect in operating rooms and on hospital wards for 15 years. I said it is over. And it was. The women dispersed. Some went to Ayumi to apologize. Others retreated to their bunks, faces showing shame. Fumiko sat alone, her certainty crumbling around her. That night, Ayumi lay on her cot and stared at the ceiling. The trial had shaken her. Not because she feared punishment from the Americans, but because it showed her how fragile their community was. How easily fear could turn them against each other. Naomi came to sit beside her, put a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. I am sorry. We were wrong. You did nothing but survive. Ayumi turned to face her. Her voice was soft, weary. Do you know what is funny? I was not planted as a spy. But after tonight, after being accused and tried and nearly cast out, I feel more loyal to the Americans than to some of you, because they never questioned my right to survive. They never punished me for adapting. They just let me be. The observation was devastating in its simplicity. The enemy had shown more acceptance than her own people, and that truth would follow all of them home. The weeks before departure moved quickly, too quickly. The women packed their few belongings, said goodbye to routines that had become familiar, prepared themselves mentally for a return to a country they no longer knew. Captain Warner met with small groups, provided information about what they would find in Japan, the occupation, the rebuilding efforts, the aid being distributed. She tried to prepare them. But how do you prepare someone for returning to ashes 2 days before the ship was scheduled to arrive? Warner called Reiko Haruka and Ayumi to her office one final time. Through Setsuko, who had become not just a translator, but a bridge between worlds. Warner offered something unexpected: letters of passage, documents explaining their treatment, stating that they had been held according to international law, that they had committed no crimes, that they were being released with full recognition of their prisoner status. The papers might not matter, might not protect them from judgment or suspicion, but Warner wanted them to have something, some proof, some shield, however thin. She also gave each of them something personal. To Reiko, she gave the wooden comb, the one that had belonged to her sister Margaret, the one killed at Pearl Harbor. I want you to have this. When you brush your daughter's hair with it, remember that peace can come from the most painful places, that mercy can grow from grief. Reiko took the comb with trembling hands, bowed deeply, Japanese style, formal and full of respect. I will tell my daughter about you, about the American woman who saved her mother's soul, not just her life. To Haruka, Warner gave a notebook, blank pages bound in leather. Write your story, what you saw, what you felt, what you learned. Someday people need to know that enemies can become more than their worst moments. Haruka clutched the notebook, thought about all the words already filling her head, all the questions and observations and realizations. Maybe someday she would have the courage to share them. To Ayumi, Warner gave a photograph, the one of herself and Margaret in their uniforms, two sisters, smiling. You remind me of her, young, brave, willing to see people as people rather than enemies. Keep that. Do not let the world make you hard. Ayumi looked at the photo, at two women who looked so happy, so full of life. One dead, one forever changed by that death. Thank you, she whispered, for showing me that strength can be gentle. The morning of departure arrived cold and clear. The entire camp turned out. American soldiers lined up, not in threat but in ceremony. A farewell that acknowledged shared humanity despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Sullivan found Haruka in the crowd. His young face was red, eyes wet. He pressed something into her hand. A photograph. His family, parents, two sisters, a dog. On the back, written in careful Japanese, that Setsuko had helped him compose Haruka. Thank you for teaching me that enemy is just a word. People are people. Write your story someday. James Sullivan, Minnesota. Haruka looked at the photo, at this American family that looked so normal, so much like any family anywhere. She looked up at Sullivan and before she could think better of it, hugged him. Brief, awkward, but genuine. Sullivan hugged back, then pulled away, wiping his eyes. He said something in English. Haruka did not understand all the words but caught the meaning. I will remember you. I will tell my children someday about the Japanese woman who taught me about humanity. She nodded, unable to speak, turned away before she started crying too hard to walk. All along the route to the trucks, Americans stood. Some saluted, some just watched quietly. There was no celebration of victory, no gloating, just a somber acknowledgement of people who had shared space and time and somehow found common ground despite the war that had brought them together. Captain Warner stood at the gate. As each woman passed, she touched their shoulder. A brief connection, a final acknowledgement. When Fumiko reached her, she stopped. This woman who had been so resistant, so certain of American cruelty, so determined to maintain hatred, she bowed. Not the shallow bow of courtesy, the deep bow of profound respect. And when she straightened, her face was wet with tears. I was wrong, she said in Japanese. Setsuko translated, I was wrong about everything. Warner nodded, put her hand on Fumiko's cheek, a gesture of such gentleness that Fumiko broke down completely, sobbed like a child. This proud woman who had held herself rigid for months finally allowed herself to feel everything she had been denying. Warner held her, let her cry, whispered words in English that needed no translation because kindness sounds the same in any language. The trucks pulled away. 47 women looked back at the camp that had been their prison and their sanctuary, at the Americans who had been their captors and their caregivers, at a place where everything they believed had been challenged and found wanting. The drive to the port took an hour. The ship waiting there was military transport, functional, not comfortable, but it would take them home, home to ashes and grief and judgment, home to a Japan they would not recognize, home to face questions they could not answer. As the ship pulled away from Saipan, Haruka stood at the rail and watched the island disappear, thought about everything that had happened, everything that had changed, everything she had learned. She took out the notebook Warner had given her, opened to the first page, and began to write. We prepared for death and received life. We prepared for cruelty and received care. We prepared to meet monsters and met human beings. I do not know what this means. I do not know how to reconcile the bombs that destroyed our cities with the blankets that warmed our nights. But I know that I will never be the same. None of us will. The voyage took 2 weeks. 2 weeks on open water with nothing to do but think, to talk, to process. The women shared their fears in long conversations on deck. What would they find? Who would still be alive? How would they be received? They made promises to stay in touch, though they all knew that the chaos of post-war Japan might make that impossible. They might scatter to the four winds and never see each other again. But they would always share these months when their world had been turned upside down, when everything they knew proved false, when mercy came from the most unexpected source. On the final night before reaching Japan, Reiko gathered everyone together, spoke words that needed to be said before they separated. We experienced something rare, something most people never see. We saw our enemies at their best, and we saw our own people at their worst. This knowledge is a burden, but it is also a gift. We know now that humanity is not determined by nationality, that kindness and cruelty exist in all people, that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. She paused, looked at each woman. When we go home, people will judge us. They will say we were weak for surrendering, disloyal for accepting enemy care, traitors for surviving. Let them say it. We know the truth. We know that staying human in inhuman circumstances is the hardest thing. That accepting mercy when you expect cruelty takes more courage than dying. Tell your children. Tell your grandchildren. Tell anyone who will listen. Not that the Americans were saints, they were not. They destroyed our cities, killed millions. But in the aftermath, some of them chose mercy over revenge, chose to follow rules even when no one would have blamed them for cruelty. And that choice matters. That choice is what separates civilization from barbarism. The women wept, held each other, knew that this moment of unity might be the last they shared. Dawn broke gray and cold. Land appeared on the horizon, Japan, home. But when the harbor of Yokohama came into view, there were no cheers. The women lined the rail in silence, staring at what had become of their country. The port was in ruins. Buildings collapsed. Ships sunk in shallow water. Cranes toppled. Everything bearing the scars of war and defeat. As they disembarked, the reality hit harder. People everywhere. Refugees. Veterans missing limbs. Children in rags. The smell of poverty and desperation thick in the air. And when people saw the women healthy and well-fed, anger flashed in some eyes. One man shouted, "You got fat while we starved. You lived well while we died." Fumiko bowed her head. The shame was crushing. They had known this would happen, but knowing did not make it easier. They were processed by occupation authorities, given papers, told they were free to go, to return to their families if they could find them. and they scattered, each woman heading toward whatever remained of home. Haruka made her way to Tokyo through roads clogged with refugees and military vehicles. When she finally reached the district where she had grown up, she found nothing. Just foundations, concrete slabs, the occasional wall standing alone like a ghost. Neighbors directed her to a refugee shelter, told her mother had survived, was living there. The shelter was a converted school. Hundreds of people crowded into classrooms, sleeping on floors, sharing thin blankets, subsisting on rations barely adequate to prevent starvation. Haruka found her mother in a corner of what had been a gymnasium. The woman was 50 years old but looked 70, skin hanging loose on bones, hair white, eyes sunken. She did not recognize her daughter. Too many months, too much suffering. Haruka's healthy appearance was so at odds with everything around her that her own mother could not process it. Mother, it is Haruka. The woman's eyes focused, widened. She reached out with shaking hands, touched Haruka's face as if confirming she was real. You are alive. My daughter is alive. They held each other. Haruka felt her mother's bones through thin clothing, felt the fragility, the nearness to death, and she felt crushing guilt that she had eaten well while this woman starved. Where is Father? Haruka already knew, but she had to ask. Her mother's face crumpled. He died. March, the firebombing. He was trying to help neighbors evacuate. A wall collapsed. He did not suffer. I found his body 2 days later. Haruka closed her eyes, let the grief wash over her. Her father, the history teacher, the man who had tried to warn everyone that the war was madness, dead because of that war, dead helping others even at the end. Her mother pulled back, looked at her daughter, really looked, saw the healthy color, the filled-out face, the clean clothes. You were captured. Yes. The Americans. Yes. Her mother said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, they fed you, yes. The word hung between them. All the questions it contained, all the judgments, all the confusion about a world where enemies fed you better than your own country. But her mother only nodded, put her hand on Haruka's cheek. I am glad you are alive. However it happened, I am glad. Reiko's journey was similar. She found her daughter living with her grandmother in the outskirts of Tokyo. The house had survived, though barely. Walls cracked, windows broken, roof patched with scrap metal. The grandmother answered the door, looked at Reiko with a mixture of joy and accusation. You look well. The 3 words contained volumes. You look well while we suffered. You look well while your daughter went hungry. You look well while Japan burned. Reiko bowed low. I am sorry. For what? For surviving well. The grandmother stepped aside. Let her enter. In the back room, a girl of 8 sat on a thin mat, drawing with a stub of pencil on scraps of paper. Reiko's daughter, grown 2 years older, thin, quiet, looking nothing like the chubby 5-year-old Reiko remembered. Sachiko, sweetheart. The girl looked up, did not recognize the woman speaking to her. Too long, too young to hold memories clearly. I am your mother. I came back. The girl stared, uncertain, frightened by this stranger claiming to be the mother she barely remembered. Reiko knelt, pulled out the wooden comb Warner had given her, the one that had belonged to Margaret, to the American nurse killed at Pearl Harbor. Can I brush your hair like I used to? The girl hesitated, then nodded slowly. Reiko began to brush, gentle strokes, the way she had when Sachiko was small, and as she brushed using a comb given to her by an American woman who had lost her sister to Japanese bombs, Reiko began to cry, not from sadness, from the impossible complexity of it all, from the knowledge that the woman who gave her this comb had more right to hatred than anyone, but had chosen mercy instead. And in that mercy, Reiko had been given the chance to hold her daughter again. The years that followed were hard. Japan rebuilt slowly. The occupation was often difficult. Resources were scarce. Many people struggled with the shame of defeat and the reality of foreign troops on their soil. The 47 women rarely spoke of their time in captivity. When asked, they said only that they had been treated according to international law. They did not mention the blankets or the tea or the miso soup or the kindness that had broken them more thoroughly than cruelty ever could. But they kept their mementos. Haruka kept the photograph of Sullivan's family, the notebook Warner had given her. Reiko used the comb every day. Ayumi kept the photo of two sisters, one living and one dead, both smiling. And they waited, wondered. Would they ever know what happened to the Americans who had shown them such unexpected humanity? 40 years past, 1985. Tokyo had risen from the ashes to become one of the world's great cities. Gleaming towers, efficient trains, prosperity that seemed impossible to anyone who remembered the ruins. Reiko was 74 years old. Her daughter Sachiko was 47 with two children of her own. Reiko had told them some stories over the years, about the war, about Saipan, about being captured, but she had never told them everything, never explained the full impact of those months in American captivity. Then an invitation arrived, a peace conference, United States and Japan, 40 years after the war, veterans and survivors gathering to acknowledge the past and look toward the future. Reiko saw the announcement and felt something stir in her chest, a possibility, a hope. She registered to attend, and she wrote a letter to the conference organizers, asking if they could help her find someone. An American military nurse who had served at a POW camp on Saipan in 1945, a woman named Elizabeth Warner. 3 weeks later, she received a reply. Captain Warner, now retired, had also registered for the conference. She would be there. The conference was held in a large hotel in Tokyo. Hundreds of people, veterans from both sides, survivors, historians, diplomats, all gathering to remember and hopefully to heal. Reiko arrived early. Her hands shook as she walked into the main hall. She had kept the wooden comb, carried it with her every day for 40 years. Now it was in her purse. Proof. Talisman. Connection to a moment that had changed her life. She scanned the crowd, looking for a face she had not seen in 4 decades. Would she even recognize Warner? Would the woman remember her? Then she saw her, standing near a window, white hair, slightly stooped with age. But those eyes, those kind, steady eyes, unmistakable. Reiko walked toward her. Each step felt like crossing an ocean, like bridging an impossible distance between past and present, between enemy and friend, between what was and what might have been. She stopped 3 feet away, spoke in English she had learned over the years. Captain Warner. The woman turned, looked at Reiko. For a moment, no recognition. Then something shifted in her face. Memory surfacing, understanding dawning. Reiko, they stared at each other. 2 elderly women, one American, one Japanese, connected by months in 1945 when one had been captor and one captive, when one had chosen mercy and one had received it. Then they moved at the same time, came together in an embrace that transcended language and nationality and all the years between. They wept, both of them, holding each other in the middle of that crowded hall. People stopped to stare. Some recognized what they were seeing, a reunion of once enemies, now friends, the kind of moment that makes history human. When they finally pulled apart, Reiko was laughing through tears. I looked for you, hoped I would find you, wondered if you remembered. Warner's voice was thick with emotion. I remembered, all of you, wondered what happened, if you survived, if you made it home, if the home you returned to was anything like the home you left. They sat together, found a quiet corner, and talked for 3 hours. 40 years compressed into conversation. What had happened, who they had become, how those months in 1945 had shaped everything that came after. Reiko told Warner about finding her daughter, about using the comb every day to brush first Sachiko's hair, then her granddaughter's, about how each time she did, she thought of Margaret, the sister Warner had lost, the nurse who died at Pearl Harbor. Your sister lives on, through this comb, through the mercy you showed us in her memory. My granddaughters know her name, know her story, know that an American woman died and another American woman chose to honor her through kindness to her enemies. Warner touched the comb that Reiko had pulled from her purse. After 40 years, still perfect, still carrying the weight of everything it represented. Margaret would have loved knowing that. She was so young, had so much ahead of her. I was angry for so long, wanted revenge, wanted someone to pay. You had every right. Having a right to hatred does not mean choosing it as wise. Warner looked at Reiko directly. Those months with you and the others, they saved me, gave me a way to channel grief into something constructive, to honor Margaret Amusik by being the nurse she was, compassionate, caring, professional, even in the hardest circumstances. Before they parted, Warner said something that Reiko would carry for the rest of her life. You taught me something too, that our enemies are not monsters, that they suffer, that they love, that they are human in all the ways that matter. That knowledge, that understanding it, is what makes peace possible. Not just absence of war, but actual peace built on recognition of shared humanity. Reiko bowed, the deep formal bow of profound respect. Thank you for seeing us as people, for treating us with dignity, for showing that mercy is not weakness, but the greatest strength. They said goodbye, exchanged addresses, promised to write, and kept that promise for the remaining years of their lives. Reiko lived until 2001, 87 years old. In her final days lying in a hospital bed with her family gathered around, she told them the full story. Everything she had held back for decades. She told them about the propaganda, about expecting torture and receiving kindness, about American women who fed her and Japanese officers who had been cruel, about blankets brought in the middle of the night and miso soup that tasted like home, and the profound confusion of being treated well by enemies. And she told them what it all meant, the lessons she had spent her life trying to understand and to pass on. Her granddaughter, 25 years old and listening intently, asked the question that mattered most. Grandmother, what is the most important thing you learned? Reiko smiled, touched the wooden comb that lay on the bedside table. Her constant companion for 56 years. That enemies can show mercy, and mercy is the greatest victory of all. She closed her eyes, her breathing slowed, and she passed peacefully surrounded by love, carrying to the end the lesson that had defined her life. The story of 47 Japanese women held prisoner by Americans in 1945 is not widely known. It is not taught in most history books. It lacks the drama of major battles or the tragedy of atomic bombs. But it matters. These small moments of humanity in the midst of inhumanity. These choices to follow rules when no one would have blamed you for cruelty. These decisions to see enemies as people rather than monsters. They matter because they show us who we can be. Not who we always are, not even who we usually are, but who we can be when we choose mercy over revenge, compassion over hatred, civilization over barbarism. Between 1945 and 1946, approximately 475 Japanese women were held as prisoners of war by American forces across the Pacific. Most survived. Many lived into their 80s and 90s, and all of them carried stories of unexpected kindness. Stories of Americans who brought blankets when they could have brought chains, who served miso soup when they could have served starvation, who chose to honor Geneva Convention rules even when their enemies had not. These stories are not about making war seem gentle or acceptable. War is horror. War is destruction. War killed millions and devastated cities and destroyed families on both sides. But in the aftermath, some people chose differently, chose to break the cycle, chose to show that even in the darkest times, humanity can persist. That is what the blankets represented, not just warmth on a cold night, but the possibility that we are not doomed to endless cycles of revenge, that mercy can break through hatred, that former enemies can become friends, that peace is not just the absence of war, but the active choice to see the humanity in those who were once trying to kill you. Haruka lived until 998. Before she died, she gave her daughter the notebook Warner had given her. Inside were decades of reflections, observations about war and peace and human nature. And on the final page, written in careful Japanese characters, a statement that summed up everything she had learned. We prepared for death but received life. We prepared for cruelty but received care. We prepared to meet monsters but met human beings. The blankets were warm, but the lesson was harder and colder. We had been lied to about everything. Yet from those lies, we learned the most important truth, that the line dividing good and evil runs not between nations, but through every human heart. And that choosing good, choosing mercy, choosing humanity, that is what makes us worthy of the name human. If you found this story meaningful, share it. Not because it makes America look good or Japan look bad or vice versa. Share it because we need these reminders that our enemies are people, that mercy is possible, that the hard choice, the choice to remain human when everything pushes us toward cruelty, that choice is always available. We live in a world still full of enemies, still full of hatred, still full of people convinced that the other side is evil incarnate. This story, these blankets brought by Americans to Japanese prisoners in 1945, they remind us that even in war, some people chose better. And if they could, maybe we can too. In our smaller wars, our daily conflicts, our personal hatreds, maybe we can remember 47 women who expected death and received tea, who expected monsters and met humans, who learned that mercy is the greatest victory of all. That is the story worth remembering. The blankets they brought, the kindness they showed, the humanity they preserved when it would have been so much easier to let it go. Remember them, honor them by choosing mercy in your own life, by seeing enemies as human, by breaking cycles of revenge before they can take root. That is how we honor the greatest generation. Not by glorifying war, but by learning the lesson some of them tried to teach. That staying human is the hardest and most important thing we can do. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering with me. These stories matter. These moments matter. These choices matter. And 47 Japanese women who once clutched makeshift weapons in the dark, waiting for American soldiers to come through their door, they would want you to know that too.